It started before the cameras rolled. The tension in the studio was already sharp enough to slice through the glossy air of late-night charm. Stephen Colbert, known for his smug grin and carefully timed sarcasm, sat in his chair, flipping through cue cards with a dismissive flick of the wrist. Across from him, Karoline Leavitt, freshly arrived and radiating the kind of self-assurance that only comes from being underestimated too many times, was adjusting her mic, brushing off a condescending remark made off-camera by one of the producers. Neither one of them knew just how far tonight's interview would spiral out of control, but both sensed that they weren't walking into a standard talk show chat. This was going to be war. From the moment the red light blinked on, everything felt off. Stephen didn't ease into the conversation with pleasantries. Instead, he opened with a question so loaded it barely passed as humor. His audience, loyal and left-leaning, laughed without realizing what had been unleashed. Karoline didn't laugh. Her smile froze into something colder, more calculating. She responded not with diplomacy, but with precision, poking holes in Stephen's assumptions in real time. His smirk faltered. The exchange quickly turned personal. What was supposed to be a policy discussion devolved into a barrage of insults dressed as punchlines. Stephen mocked Karoline's political career, questioning her credentials with a sarcastic flourish. Karoline, unshaken, fired back with a sharp critique of his platform, accusing him of hiding behind his jokes to avoid real accountability. Her voice never rose, but her words cut clean, and suddenly Stephen wasn't in control of the room anymore. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some still chuckled nervously, unsure if this was part of the act, but it wasn't. Stephen leaned forward, visibly irritated. He interrupted Karoline mid-sentence, his voice sharpening as he tried to regain control, but the damage was already done. She didn't flinch. She leaned back, crossed her legs, and delivered a calm, pointed takedown of his treatment of conservative guests, calling it what it was: performative, dismissive, and ultimately cowardly. That was the spark. Stephen's face reddened. He dropped all pretense of playfulness and confronted her outright, accusing her of being part of what he called the political erosion of truth. Karoline snapped back, saying Stephen had spent years turning politics into late-night theater and feeding the audience nothing but outrage disguised as enlightenment. Her words were heavy, her tone unrelenting, and her gaze didn't waver once. The producers in the wing started whispering frantically. The interview had gone off script. Way off. Stephen, clearly agitated now, turned to the audience and threw out a line meant to humiliate her, a cheap jab about her age, experience, and background. The crowd half laughed, but it wasn't clean. It was awkward, tense. Karoline's eyes narrowed. She sat forward, placed both hands on the desk between them, and dismantled his joke with brutal efficiency, pulling from his own past controversies, turning the mirror back on him with startling clarity. For a moment, silence hung in the air like fog. Even the house band stopped fidgeting. It wasn't supposed to go this way. Karoline had turned what was meant to be an ambush into a battleground, and Stephen was losing ground. That's when Stephen crossed the line. He raised his voice, visibly shaken now, and called her presence on his show dangerous. It wasn't just a jab. It was an outright accusation, a line drawn not in sarcasm but in hostility. Karoline didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She simply responded with a damning monologue that challenged everything the show pretended to stand for. She questioned the authenticity of its message, the hypocrisy of its tone, and the arrogance of its host. The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay silent. It was a spectacle, but not the kind they tuned in for. Stephen reached for a commercial break, an escape hatch, but Karoline wasn't finished. She turned to the camera, ignored the chaos around her, and spoke directly to the people watching at home. Her words weren't just political, they were personal, filled with grit and fire, daring anyone to deny what they had just witnessed. The control Stephen once had vanished, and it showed in his expression, now a mixture of disbelief and anger. And just as the producers motioned for a cut, Karoline delivered one final blow that sent a ripple through the room. Stephen's chair shifted. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk. He didn't interrupt. He couldn't. He knew he had lost the moment. Then the screen faded to black. As the show returned from the commercial break, everything had changed. The usual musical sting felt out of place, awkwardly upbeat in the midst of what had become a tense standoff. Stephen Colbert, no longer grinning, sat rigid in his chair, visibly uncomfortable. Karoline Leavitt remained composed, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. The audience, now quieter and more uncertain, shifted in their seats. Laughter had evaporated. The air in the room felt thick, uneasy, like a storm waiting to break. Stephen tried to recalibrate. He attempted a joke to lighten the mood, but it fell flat. A few polite chuckles trickled out, but even they sounded forced. He pivoted, trying to return to the interview's original direction, but Karoline wasn't offering him any handholds. She wasn't there to play along. Every answer she gave was laced with challenge, with an edge of contempt that made it clear she no longer respected the premise of the conversation, or the host. That only made things worse. Stephen shifted from sarcastic to hostile. His questions turned accusatory, then borderline aggressive. He accused Karoline of promoting ideas he found reprehensible, cherry-picking from her past statements and affiliations with the sole intent of cornering her. But Karoline refused to be rattled. She hit back harder, more focused, picking apart Stephen's show segment by segment. She questioned how someone who preached tolerance could be so selective in who he chose to platform with respect. Her words weren't emotional. They were strategic. She wasn't fighting for herself. She was exposing him. Stephen leaned forward again, more confrontational now, pressing her for answers in a tone that barely disguised his contempt. Karoline, instead of retreating, called him out for trying to craft a viral moment at her expense. She said the show no longer served the public. It served his ego. Her words sent another shock through the studio, this time quieter, but deeper. It was no longer a disagreement. It was personal. The audience had split. Half sat frozen, watching with wide eyes. The other half looked toward the exit signs or at each other, unsure how to respond. This wasn't the kind of segment you could clap your way through. This wasn't entertainment. It was exposure. Stephen raised his hand toward the control booth and gave a signal that wasn't subtle. Security moved from the wings. At first it looked procedural, but then it became clear what was about to happen. He wasn't going to finish the interview. He was going to end it. Karoline stood before anyone reached her. She didn't wait to be told. She adjusted her blazer, turned toward the audience, and with a glance toward the camera delivered one final line. Not loud, not theatrical, just quiet and sharp enough to puncture whatever illusion remained. The cameras stayed on her as she walked off set. Stephen tried to recover. He looked at the camera and attempted a closing quip, something to neutralize the moment, but his voice lacked confidence. It was a miscalculation from a man used to control, now facing the cost of losing it. The live audience was still silent, the sound of Karoline's heels echoing as she exited the stage, louder than anything else in the studio. But the real explosion happened after the show ended. Clips of the confrontation hit social media within minutes. Viewers at home who had tuned in for late-night banter instead witnessed a clash of egos and ideologies. The footage was raw, awkward, and entirely unedited. It spread fast. Some praised Stephen for trying to confront what he saw as misinformation. Others tore him apart for mishandling the interview, for losing control, for letting his bias turn into a tantrum. But overwhelmingly the attention was on Karoline. She hadn't stormed off. She hadn't lashed out. She had stayed calm, calculated, and direct. And in doing so, She made a seasoned host look like a bitter man playing a game he no longer knew how to win. By morning, news outlets were covering it from every angle. Pundits speculated about whether the producers would apologize, whether Stephen would address it on his next show, and whether Karoline's appearance had backfired or launched her into a new tier of visibility. She had walked into enemy territory and left unscathed, leaving behind a host who looked like he had just lost more than an argument. But Karoline wasn't done yet. While Colbert's team scrambled to manage the fallout, she was preparing for what would come next. A direct message to the public, unfiltered by late-night editing or narrative spin. Karoline's message came less than 24 hours later. It wasn't part of a press tour, and it wasn't staged on a polished news set. It was raw, shot in a simple room, her voice calm but edged with clarity. She addressed the confrontation, head-on, laying out the facts without dramatics. No edits, no special effects. Just truth spoken plainly and powerfully. She recounted how she was invited to Stephen Colbert's show under the guise of civil discourse, only to be blindsided by condescension, insults, and a calculated attempt to humiliate her. She didn't flinch. Instead, she thanked him for proving her point better than she ever could have on her own. The video exploded. Millions watched, not because she shouted or played the victim, but because she carried herself with composure, while standing in the eye of a storm. Viewers from every side took notice. She had gone into the lion's den, not to provoke, but to reveal, and what she revealed was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Stephen's team struggled to contain the backlash. His silence after the episode aired only made things worse. When he finally returned to the show 2 nights later, his tone was noticeably different. He tried to joke about the incident, but even he knew the moment had passed. The audience was less responsive. The room felt colder. He acknowledged the confrontation, but instead of addressing his own role, he doubled down, framing Karoline as aggressive, even manipulative. It fell flat. The spin wasn't working. People had already seen the footage. They had seen him lose control. They had seen her hold her ground without shouting, without folding, without giving him the collapse he was clearly trying to provoke. Commentators began drawing comparisons. They weren't flattering. Karoline was now being mentioned in headlines as a political figure who could hold her own in hostile territory, someone who didn't shy away from discomfort, who could weaponize composure in a space built on chaos. She didn't need applause. She needed just one moment to expose hypocrisy, and she got it. The consequences were immediate. Ratings for the show dipped in the week that followed, while Karoline's appearance was dissected and replayed across countless channels and platforms. Her words became sound bites. Her calmness under fire became the story. People who had never heard her name were now curious, some skeptical but many impressed, not by her ideology necessarily, but by her command of the moment. Backstage accounts from that night began leaking. Staffers described the tension before the taping, the smugness that turned to frustration as Stephen realized he had met his match. Even members of the production team, some speaking anonymously, admitted that the moment had spiraled further than anyone anticipated. What was supposed to be a clever dismantling turned into a televised defeat. And Karoline? She didn't gloat. She didn't issue a victory lap or posture on the talk show circuit. She stayed quiet, letting the footage speak for itself. That silence, deliberate and measured, only amplified her impact. While Stephen scrambled to regain narrative control, she moved on, undaunted, undistracted. But her silence broke one last time. At a public forum days later, a reporter asked her if she regretted going on the show. Her answer came without hesitation. She said no, because for the first time in a long time, people got to see what happens when the curtain falls, when the performance ends, and the host loses the script. She said that kind of truth is rare, and when you find it, even in conflict, you don't walk away from it. You stand in it. That statement echoed beyond the room. Stephen's show would recover eventually, but the stain of that night would linger. Not just because of what was said, but because of how it all fell apart. A man who built his career on confronting others had finally met someone who confronted him, and did it without shouting, without spectacle, and without surrender. Karoline Leavitt walked off that stage with more than pride. She walked off with proof. Proof that you don't need to be loud to be powerful. That silence can be louder than applause. And that sometimes the most triumphant moment comes not from winning a debate, but from showing the world who truly lost it. The audience saw it. The world felt it, and no one would forget it.